In this series, we've seen triads, we've seen 7th chords, then 9th chords, and recently 11th chords. So now it's time for the last one and finish the cycle. We are going to talk about 13th chords. So what is a 13th chord? It's a chord with 7 different notes, a root note, a 3rd, a 5th, a 7th, a 9th, an 11th, and a 13th. So technically, it's just playing all the notes of a scale all at the same time, hoping for the best. But with so many notes in a 13th chord, how do you not make them dissonant? And how do you even tell a C chord from an E chord if they both have the same notes? So we'll clear that all out during this video, so by the end you should be able to use 13th chord in your own chord progressions. So let's start from the beginning, because we need to know what we're dealing with. The name of a chord is made of 3 parts: the root note, the quality of the chord, and the extensions. The root note is the note the chord starts from. The quality gives the state of the 3rd, the 5th, and the 7th, like in a 7th chord. So for example, minor means the 3rd and the 7th are minor, like in a minor 7th chord. And major means the 3rd and the 7th are major, just like in a major 7th chord. And then the extension is the highest extension of the chord. All the lower extensions are implied, and they are major by default. So that means a 13th chord implies that there is also a perfect 11th with a major 9th. This is not like writing at 13, for example. If we write C at 13, that would mean a C major triad with only the 13th added. Then after the extension, we can add some alterations to say if we want to raise or lower some notes in the chord. For example, if I write the chord C13 sharp 11, that means that it starts from C. No quality is written, so that means dominant. So that's a major 3rd, a perfect 5th, and a minor 7th, like in a dominant 7th chord. Then we add all the extensions up to the 13th. So that's a major 9th, a perfect 11th, and a major 13th. And then we raise the 11th by a semitone. So that's a chord made of the notes C, E, G, B flat, D, F sharp, and A. Chapter 2, 13th chords in the major scale. So let's see some examples. Let's take a major scale and start with the first note to build a 13th chord. So that would make a chord of the 1st degree. And that is made of a major 3rd, a perfect 5th, a major 7th, a major 9th, a perfect 11th, and a major 13th. So that's like a major 7th chord with all the extensions major up to the 13th. So we can name it a major 13th chord. Now, if we start from the second note of the scale to make a chord of the 2nd degree, the chord would have a minor 3rd, a perfect 5th, a minor 7th, a major 9th, a perfect 11th, and a major 13th. So that's like a minor 7th chord with only major extensions up to the 13th. So we can note that as a minor 13th chord. If we create chords for all the degrees of the major scale, we get this. And all these chords technically use exactly the same notes, as they all use all the notes of the scale. And as expected, most of them are pretty dissonant at the moment. So to make them more easily usable, we have to talk about a few common practices to use 13th chords. Chapter 3, omitting notes. So typically, to remove some dissonances, we tend to omit some notes, and several options are possible. The most common is to omit the 5th and the 9th of the chord, to keep the root note, the 3rd, the 7th, the 11th, and the 13th. And if you're writing for a 4-voice arrangement, you can even remove the 11th. Another common combination is to omit the 7th and the 11th. This would keep only the root note, the 3rd, the 5th, the 9th, and the 13th. In this case, that makes a chord that we can call a 6-9. As the 13th is the same note as the 6th, that makes a triad with a 6th and a 9th. So these are the basic guidelines we can start with, to which we can add all the other guidelines that applied for the 7th, 9th, and 11th chords. To name a few, in a diminished or half-diminished chord, extensions above the 7th can be removed. A minor 9th is typically removed if it's not part of a dominant chord, and in an 11th chord with a major 3rd, the 11th becomes dissonant, which can already explain why the 11th can be so easily removed, according to both these first guidelines. So with all this, we can already start to simplify the chords of the major scale, and this is the result. Though some of these chords still bring a lot of tension, and that's kind of the nature of 13th chords, which have like the maximum amount of extensions you can add to a chord. So in addition to omitting notes, we can also alter some of them. Chapter 4, altering notes. So altering notes, which means raising or lowering some notes by a semitone, can help reduce dissonances in a chord by spacing the notes in a more consonant way. So a common way to alter the 13th is to lower it to make it a minor 13th. In a minor chord, this is rather consonant, as it makes a chord naturally found on the 1st degree of the minor scale or on the 6th degree of a major scale. In order to hear the difference it makes, I'll play a minor 13th chord as is, then I'll play it with the flat 13, then without the 5th and the 9th, and finally without the 7th and the 11th. In a major chord, putting a minor 13th is a lot more dissonant, and you'd also have to play with the dissonance between the major 3rd and the perfect 11th, either by removing the 3rd, removing the 11th, or by raising the 11th. So just so you can have different options, here are a few examples. Now, the flat 13 is more common on a dominant chord, particularly if it's to go to a minor chord, because the minor 13th here would become the minor 3rd of the chord that resolves it. And again, you'd have to play with the dissonance between the major 3rd and the perfect 11th. So here are a few possible combinations. So I will add those chords we just saw to the list of chords for the major scale. So this is way enough to use these chords in your own songs. And yet, there is still something to see that I find very interesting, and it's hiding in the inversions of the chords. Chapter 5, Inversions. So we started with chords that contained all the notes of the scale. So if we rearrange the notes of one of those chords, it will form another chord of the same scale. They were essentially the same chord. Then we removed some of the notes in each of them. So let's see what happens when we invert them now. Let's start with the case where we removed the 5th, the 9th and the 11th to keep the root, the 3rd, the 7th and the 13th. If we move the 13th down an octave and consider it like our new root note, then the old root note becomes the 3rd becomes the 5th and the 7th becomes the 9th. So that's a triad with the 9th added. That's a add 9 chord. If we started with a major 13th chord, that would make a minor add 9 chord. If we started with a minor 13th chord, that would make a diminished add flat 9 chord, which I guess is pretty dissonant. So maybe we can try lowering the 13th there. That will make that new chord a major add 9, which is a lot more consonant. And if we start with a dominant 13th chord, that would make a minor add flat 9 chord, which also brings a lot of tension, but I guess it is more easily acceptable for a dominant chord. So these versions of 13th chords are simply inversions of add 9 chords. Now, what happens if we take the version where we remove only the 5th and the 9th to keep the root note, the 3rd, the 7th, the 11th and the 13th? If we take the 13th and put it at the base to consider it like the root note of the chord, it's just like we removed the 7th and the 11th, which is our second guideline for omitting notes, which means the second guideline is kind of just an inversion of the first. So what I'm trying to show with this is that with 13th chords, the difference between omitting notes of a chord to give it a certain color and replacing the chord entirely is kind of blurred. To a certain extent, changing the quality of a chord and substituting a chord for another is kind of the same thing. This ambiguity, combined with the rather dissonant nature of 13th chords, make them work particularly well on dominant chords, but also on borrowed and substituted chords. And that will be one of the subjects of the next video. But for now, we can apply everything we've seen today to each chord of the major scale to get all the chords we can use. And that is all the chords you need to use 13th chord in your compositions. You can note this, screenshot this, and this will be added to my full music theory cheat sheet on my Patreon. Then we can do the same thing for the natural minor scale, and we can go further with the harmonic minor scale and the melodic minor scale. Now, that will be all for me today, so big thanks to everyone supporting the channel on Patreon. In the meantime, I wish you all a great evening or a great day. Take care of yourself, take care of each other, and I'll see you next time. Bye!